The Floating Island of Madness by Jason Kirby. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Ben Tucker. The Floating Island of Madness by Jason Kirby. Above us curved the pale hot bowl of cloudless sky. Below us stretched the rolling tawny wastes of the great Arabian desert. And away to the east, close to the dipping horizon, scudded the tiny speck we were following. We had been following it since dawn, and it was now close to sunset. Where was it leading us? Should we go on or turn back? How much longer would our gas and oil hold out? And just where were we? I turned and saw my questions reflected in the eyes of my companions, Paul Foulet of the French Sûreté and Douglas Bryce of Scotland Yard. "Too fast!" shouted Bryce above the roar of our motors. I nodded. His gesture explained his meaning. The plane ahead had suddenly taken on a terrific, unbelievable speed. All day it had traveled normally, maintaining but not increasing the distance between us. But in the last 15 minutes it had leaped into space. 15 minutes before it had been 2 miles in the lead. Now it was barely visible, a tiny vanishing speck. What could account for this burst of superhuman speed? Who was in that plane? What was in that plane? I glanced at Foulet. He shrugged noncommittally, waving a courteous hand toward Bryce. I understood. I agreed with him. This was Bryce's party, and the decision was up to him. Foulet and I just happened to be along. It was partly design and partly coincidence. 2 days before I had been in Constantinople. I was disheartened and utterly disgusted. All the way from the home office of the United States Secret Service in Washington, I had trailed my man, only to lose him. On steamships, by railway, airplane, and motor we had traveled, always with my quarry just one tantalizing jump ahead of me. And in Constantinople, I had lost him. And it was a ruse a child should have seen through. I could have beaten my head against a wall. And then suddenly I had run into Foulet. Not 10 days before I had talked to him in his office in Paris. I told him a little of my errand, for I was working on the hunch that this man I was after concerned not only the United States, but France and the continent as well. And what Foulet told me only served to strengthen my conviction. So meeting him in Constantinople was a thin ray of light in my disgusted darkness. At least I could explode to a kindred spirit. "Lost your man?" was his greeting, and it wasn't a question, it was a statement. "How did you know?" I growled. My humiliation was too fresh to stand kidding. "Constantinople," said Foulet amiably. "You always lose them in Constantinople. I've lost 3 here." "3?" I said. "Like mine." "Exactly," he nodded. Then he lowered his voice. "Come to my hotel. We can talk there." "Now," he continued 15 minutes later as we settled ourselves into his room, "you were very circumspect in Paris. You told me little, just a hint here and there. But it was enough. You, the United States, have joined our ranks." "You mean—" "I mean that for a year we, the various Secret Service organizations of the continent, and that includes, of course, Scotland Yard, have been after— well, to be frank, we don't know what we're after. But we do know this. There is a power. There is someone somewhere who is trying to conquer the world." "Are you serious?" I glanced at him, but the tight lines of his set mouth convinced me. "I beg your pardon," I murmured. "Go ahead." "I don't blame you for thinking it was a jest," he said imperturbably. "But to prove I know what I am talking about, let me tell you what this man has done whom you have been pursuing. He has done one of 2 things. Either he has proved himself a dangerous revolutionary, or he has engineered the failure of a bank or chain of banks." "We can't prove it," I interrupted. "No," said Foulet. "Neither can we. Neither can Scotland Yard, or the secret services of Belgium or Germany or Italy or Spain. But there you are." "You mean that in all these countries?" "I mean that for a year, probably longer, these countries have been and are being steadily and systematically undermined. The moral of the people is being weakened. Their faith in their government is being betrayed.
and someone is behind it. Someone who can think faster and plan more carefully than we. Someone whose agents we always lose in Constantinople. I wager you lost your man from a rooftop."
I nodded, my disgust at my own stupidity returning in full force. "There was a lower roof and a maze of crisscross alleys," I muttered. "He got away."
"Was there an airplane anywhere around?"
asked Foulet. I glanced at him in surprise. What good would an airplane have been on a rooftop 10 feet wide by 12 feet long? Then I remembered. "There was an airplane," I said, "but it was a long way off and I could scarcely see it, but the air was very still and I heard the motor." Foulet nodded.
"And if you had had a pair of glasses," he said gently, "you would have seen that the airplane had a glider attached to it. There is always an airplane and a glider when we lose our men from the roofs of Constantinople."
"But that must be a coincidence," I insisted. "Why, I was on that roof right on the fellow's heels, and the airplane was at least 5 miles away."
Foulet shrugged. "Coincidence? Possibly," he said, "but it is our only clue."
"Of course," I murmured thoughtfully. "You have never been able to follow." Foulet smiled.
"Can you imagine where that airplane will be by the time we climbed down off our roofs and got to a flying field and started in pursuit?"
We descended for dinner. Foulet's story had restored my self-confidence somewhat, but I was still sore. Of course, Foulet connecting my vanishing man with that disappearing plane was absurd. But where had the man gone? Was my supposition that he had jumped to a lower roof, climbed a wall, and run through the maze of alleyways in half a minute in any way less absurd? We were halfway through dinner when Bryce appeared. Bryce was one of the best men in Scotland Yard, and I had known him many years. So evidently had Foulet, for his eyes flickered faintly with pleased surprise at the sight of him. Bryce came directly to our table. He was bursting with victorious joy. I could feel it somehow, although his face, carefully schooled to betray no emotion, was placid and casual. All through the remainder of the meal I could feel the vibrations of his excitement, but it was only at the very end that he confided anything. And his confidence only served to make the excitement and sense of impending thrill greater. Just as he was rising to leave, he shoved a tiny strip of paper across the table to me with a sidelong glance at Foulet. "Another rooftop," I read, scrawled in pencil. "If you like, meet me at the flying field before dawn." If I liked. I shoved the paper across to Foulet, who read it, and carelessly twisted it into a spill to light his cigar. But his hand shook ever so slightly. Needless to say, we went to the flying field shortly after midnight. Bruce was there, pacing up and down restlessly. Near him was a huge tri-motored biplane, its motor humming in readiness.
"I've put a man on the trail in my place," Bryce told us briefly. "Somebody else is going to lose the scent on a rooftop, and I'm going to watch."
We settled to our wait. To me it seemed absurdly hopeless. The flying field was on a slight rise. Below us spread the dark shadow that was Constantinople. There was no moon to give it form and substance. It was just a lake of deeper darkness, a spreading mass of silent rooftops and minarets. How did Bryce expect to see his quarry escape? Suppose he fled during the night, and even with daylight. The first streaks of dawn found us still waiting, our ears strained for the hum of an airplane motor. But hardly had the golden rim of the sun appeared over the horizon when it came. It came from the east, straight out of the golden glory of the sun. Nearer and nearer it came, an airplane, alone.
"It hasn't got the glider,"
muttered Foulet, and his tone was tinged with disappointment. But hardly had he spoken when, from one of the myriad rooftops below us, rose a swift streak of shadow. So fast it flew, with such unbelievable speed, that to our eyes it was little more than a blur. But,
"The glider!"
Bryce gasped.
"My God, how did he do it?"
We stared, silent with amazement. The airplane that only a second before had flown alone now was towing a glider that had arisen as by magic from the housetops. Another instant and we had piled into the cockpit of the tri-motored plane and were off on a pursuit. That pursuit that led us on till, as the sun sank behind us, we found ourselves above the illimitable tawny wastes of the great Arabian desert. And now what? All day long, as I have said, the plane we were pursuing had maintained but never increased the distance between us. Each hour had brought us renewed hope that the next hour would bring capture, or at least some definite clue, some shred of information. But the plane still towing its glider had gone on and on, steadily, imperturbably, and we dared not open fire and attempt to bring it down for fear of destroying our one meager chance of following it to its destination. And now it had vanished. Suddenly, unaccountably, it had taken on that terrific burst of speed which I have described. In 10 minutes it had become a speck on the far horizon. In another instant it was gone. We were alone. Night was falling. If we turned back, our gas might bring us to safety. If we went on... what? I turned to my companions. Foulet still maintained his noncommittal attitude. But Bryce was deeply disappointed and worried. His ruddy English face was knotted in a scowl and his blue eyes were dark. Quickly he jerked his head back. We understood. Of course, turning back was the only thing to do. To go on was absurd. Our quarry had totally disappeared. But it was heartbreaking. Once again we had been fooled and outwitted. Our disappointment filled that tiny cockpit like a tangible mist. Bryce threw over the stick with a gesture of disgust. In response, our right wing lifted a bit, seemed to shake itself, then settled, and the plane continued on its course. Bryce's eyes flickered with surprise. He shoved the stick back, threw it over again, but toward the opposite side. Obediently, our left wing lifted as if to bank. A shudder passed through it. It dropped, the plane leveled, and we went on. Foulet leaned forward. His eyes were gleaming, his face flushed and eager. "Climb!" he yelled above the roar of the motors. "Up!" Bryce nodded, but it was no use. That plane was like a live thing. Nothing we could do would swerve it from its course. We stared at one another. Were we mad? Were we under a hypnotic spell? But our minds were clear, and the idea of hypnosis was absurd, for we had tried to turn back. It was the machine that refused to obey. Again Foulet leaned forward. "Drop!" he shouted. Bryce nodded, but the plane refused to respond. On and on, straight as a die, it sped. "Try slowing the motor," I yelled into Bryce's ear, and both Foulet and I leaned forward to watch the results. The motors slowed. Gradually, the roaring, pounding hum lessened, and our speed continued. The whine of the wind in the wires abated not one whit. The speedometer on our instrument board climbed. Bryce turned. His face in the deepening dusk was a blur of pasty white. His hands hung at his sides. The motors purred, pulsed, were silent. The plane, unaided, unguided, flew alone. We sat, hushed and unbelieving in that terrible death-like silence. Our ears, attuned all day to the deafening roar of the motors, felt as if they would burst in the sudden agonizing stillness. There was not a sound, save the whine of the wind in the wires as the plane sped on. Above us curved the illimitable arch of darkening sky. Below us lay the empty stretch of blank desert. We didn't speak. I know that I, for one, could not bring my voice to break that ominous stillness. Silently we sat there, watching, waiting. The quick darkness of the desert felt like a velvet curtain. The stars burst forth, as if lit by an invisible hand. Foulet stirred, leaned forward, gasped. My eyes followed his gaze. Before our plane spread a path of light, dull, ruddily glowing, like the ghost of living embers. It cut the darkness of the night like a flaming finger, and along it we sped as if on an invisible track. "The speed of that other plane," muttered Bryce, breaking that utter silence. "This was it." Foulet and I nodded. Well could I imagine that we were traveling at that same terrific, impossible speed, and we were helpless in the clutch of... what? What power lay behind this band of light that drew us irresistibly toward it? The ruddy pathway brightened. The light grew stronger. Our speed increased. The whine of the wires was tuned almost past human hearing. The plane trembled like a live thing in the grip of inhuman forces. A great glowing eye suddenly burst from the rim of the horizon, the source of the light. Instinctively I closed my eyes. What power might that eye possess? The same thought must have struck Bryce and Foulet, for they ducked to the floor of the cockpit, pulling me with them. "Take care," Bryce muttered. "It might blind us." We sat huddled in that cockpit for what seemed an eternity, though it couldn't have been more than 2 minutes. The glare increased. It threw into sharp, uncanny relief every tiny detail of the cockpit and of our faces. The light was as powerful as a searchlight, but not so blinding. It had a rosy, diffused quality that the searchlight lacks. In that eternity of tense waiting, I tried to collect my thoughts. I told myself that I must keep steady, that I must keep my mind clear. I struggled to get a grip on myself. The light, the steady flying without power, the boundless, horrible silence had shaken me. But there was more to come. I knew it. We all knew it. And it was not physical strength that would pull us through. It was wits. We must hold steady. Thank God we all had years of training, war experience, peace experience, countless life and death adventures behind us. It would all count now. It would all help us to keep our brains clear and cool. Wits, I thought again. Only our wits would stand between us and... what? The ground wheels of the plane struck something solid, rolled, stopped. The light snapped off. The sudden blackness, falling like a blanket of thick fur, choked me. In that first, dazed, gasping instant, I was conscious of only one thing. The plane was no longer in motion, but we had not dropped. Of that I was sure. We were still, as we had been, close to 2,000 feet above the earth. Then came the sound of running feet and a confused blur of voices. The door of the cockpit was thrown open. A man leaned in, his hand on the jamb.
"Inspector Bryce," he said quietly. "Monsieur Follet, Lieutenant Ainsley, we are glad to welcome you."
His words were courteous, but something in his tone sent a tingling chill down my spine. It was cold, as soulless as the clink of metal. It was dull without life or inflection. But there was something else, something I could not name. I was nearest the door and scrambled out first. To my surprise, it was not dark. We were enveloped by a radiance, rosy as the broad ray had been, but fainter like the afterglow of a sunset. By this light I could make out, vaguely, our surroundings. We seemed to be on a plateau, a great flat space probably an acre in extent, surrounded by a 6-foot wall. Behind us there was a wide gateway through which our airplane had just come and across which workmen were dropping bars made of some material like cement. Before us, dotting this acre or so of plateau, were small domed structures made of the same cement-like material. In the center of the plateau rose a large domed building with a segment of its roof open to the stars, and through this opening I could see the shadowy suggestion of a great lamp. There was the source of that powerful magnetic ray. Follet and Bryce scrambled out and stood beside me. They said never a word, but I knew that every sense was alert.
"If you will follow me,"
that same cold, expressionless voice murmured. I turned to look at the man. He was not bad-looking, clean-shaven, well-tailored. He swung his eyes to meet my gaze, and as he did so, that same chill fled along my spine. His eyes. What was the matter with them? They were dark, brown or black, and as shiny as shoe buttons. But there was no gleam of expression in them. Their shine was the glitter of polished glass. Without a word, we followed him across the small cleared space where our airplane stood, past a row of these small domed structures, to a low door cut in the white wall of the great central building. At the doorway he turned.
"I am taking you to the master," he said.
Then over his shoulder he added,
"There is no means of escape. We are 2,000 feet above the earth."
And he laughed, a quick, short cackle of crazy laughter. I felt the breath catch in my throat and the short hairs prickle at my neck. Follet gripped my arm. Through my coat I could feel the chill of his fingers, but his grasp steadied me. We walked on, following our guide, down a narrow passageway through a low arched door into a small room, evidently an antechamber to a large room beyond. Without a word, our guide left us, passing through another door which he closed after him. Bryce and Follet and I exchanged looks, but we were silent. It might be we were watched. It might be that the very walls had ears. We could trust nothing. Our guide returned.
"The master,"
he said, and flung open a wide door. We found ourselves in a large room filled with paraphernalia of all sorts, wires, lights, laboratory tables cluttered with test tubes and apparatus, and in the midst of this ordered chaos stood a man, his gleaming eyes watching us fixedly. At first I was conscious of nothing but his eyes, large, coal-black, and shiny with that peculiar expressionless gloss I had noted in the eyes of our guide. Later I realized that he was of slight build, meticulously neat, with a tiny black waxed mustache and a carefully trimmed Van Dyke beard.
"Welcome to my floating island,"
he said gravely, never swerving those shiny eyes for an instant.
"We have hoped long for your coming."
He paused, noiselessly rubbing his hands and watching us. We stared back, fascinated by that glossy, fixed gaze.
"There is so much to tell you," he went on, "and to ask you."
He permitted himself a slow smile that spread his lips but failed to reach his eyes.
"During your stay here," he continued, "which I hope will be both long and profitable, you will become my slaves and will know me as master. But before you come under my dominion, you may know my name."
For the first time he moved his eyes. His glance swept the room as if to assure himself we were alone. He stepped, as swiftly and softly as a cat, over to the door through which we had entered, opened it, spoke to our guide who was waiting in the anteroom, closed it, and returned. He faced us, his lips smiling and his eyes as blank as polished agate.
"My name," he said softly, "is Algernon Frederick Fraser."
He paused and watched us. Behind me I felt Foulet start. I heard Bryce's quickly suppressed gasp. My own throat closed on words that might have been fatal. Algernon Frederick Fraser. Was it possible? Could it be? 5 years before, Fraser had suddenly burst on the world of science. He had made some amazing discoveries regarding the power of light, discoveries that would reorganize the living conditions of the world. For a week or two, the papers were filled with the man's amazing genius. Then, no more was heard of him. Had he died? What was the story? 2 years passed, and even the name of Fraser was forgotten. Then suddenly it burst forth again in the headlines of the world. Fraser had disappeared. Fraser had vanished. But not as a brilliant genius of science. He had gone as an escaped lunatic. After his amazing burst of fame, his mind snapped. Somehow the story had been kept out of the press. Fraser was incarcerated in a quiet, very private asylum, and that was all. All until he escaped. When that happened, the story couldn't be hushed any longer. The press was informed. The people were warned. He became known as the Mad Menace. The police and the Secret Service organizations of the world searched for him. His name became a byword. Where had he gone? What would he do? What was his scheme? For he was still the astounding scientific genius. That portion of his mind was untouched. At the time of his escape, the physicians in charge of the case assured the press that Fraser's scientific mind was every bit as sound as ever. And that was all. Aside from his god science, he was a maniac, inhuman, cruel, unreasoning. What would such a man do loosed in the world? What might he not do? Was it possible that it was this man who stood before us now with his eyes fastened upon us so intently, and his lips spread in that little empty smile? Suddenly I knew. Those eyes were the shiny, vacuous, soulless eyes of a madman.
"I see," he said softly, "that you have heard of me. But it is 3 years since your world has seen me, yes?"
He laughed, a low laugh that seemed to freeze the air around him.
"They call me mad."
His smile faded. His eyes bored through us like steel needles.
"I am not mad. No madman can do what I have done in 3 years."
For the first time an expression flickered in his eyes, a crafty gleam of vanity that flared instantaneously.
"Would you like to see?"
He leaned toward us. We bowed, but it was Bryce who spoke.
"Very much, Dr. Fraser." "Don't call me that!"
The man whirled like a tiger ready to spring.
"Don't call me that! I am master here. Call me master. Say it!"
His voice rose to a shriek.
"Say it, master!"
I clamped my teeth against the bloodless horror of that maniacal voice. It chilled my veins. Again I felt the hair rise on my scalp. Bryce bowed quietly, and his eyes, serene and blue, met Fraser's fairly.
"Of course, master."
His low English voice soothed the bristling silence.
"I am sure I speak for Monsieur Foulet and Lieutenant Ainsley when I say that we would be most deeply interested in your achievements."
Fraser was placated. He relaxed. He softly rubbed his hands while a smug, crafty smile flitted across his lips.
"You will follow me," he murmured.
He led the way back through the anteroom and down the passageway till we stood again under the stars, and again I was struck by the strange light, warm and faint and rosy like a sunset afterglow. As if he read my thought, Fraser turned to me.
"I will first show you the source of this rosy light. That, I believe, will explain a great deal."
He led the way down one of the narrow pathways between the low domed houses, if they could be called houses, for they were little larger than kennels. At the 6-foot wall that surrounded this plateau, he paused.
"Would you like to look over the wall?"
he asked. For the space of a breath, we hesitated. Was this a trap? Through my mind flashed the words of the man who had guided us to Fraser. "You are 2,000 feet above the earth," he had said. Was that true? And if it were, might not Fraser push us over the wall? But instantly logic came to my rescue. Fraser had brought us here, and he could have brought us but for one thing, to question us. Would he be apt to do us harm before those questions were asked? And besides, would Fraser's brilliantly subtle mind stoop so low as to destroy enemies by pushing them over a wall? "Thank you," we murmured simultaneously.
"This whole achievement is of tremendous interest to us,"
Foulet added. Fraser chuckled.
"It will be of greater interest later,"
he said, and his blank, glittering eyes rested on first one of us, then another, with a cold, satisfied gleam. Then he lifted his hand and opened a square door in the wall about the size of a porthole. To my surprise, the little door swung back as lightly as a feather, and made scarcely a sound as it slammed against the wall itself. Again Fraser answered my unspoken thought.
"It has only one substance," he said with a vain smirk. "No weight whatever. This entire platform, together with its huts, is lighter than air. If I should tear loose this little door, it would float out of my hands instantly and go straight up to the stars. The substance, I've called it fleotite, is not only lighter than air, but lighter than ether."
"But we are not floating," said Bryce. "We are stationary. Is the lightness of your fleotite counteracted by the weight of the men and machines?"
Fraser shook his head. "Not entirely," he said. "But first look through this little window. Then I will explain."
Eagerly we pressed forward. Our danger was almost forgotten in our interest. This was amazing, stupendous. Together, shoulder to shoulder, we gazed through the aperture. We were suspended in space. Above us shone the blue-black Arabian night, and beneath us, far, far beneath, lay the sands of the desert looking rosy and warm in that same dull red glare of light that, to a fainter degree, gave us the effect of afterglow. But we were not floating. We were anchored as securely as a ship riding in a calm harbor. We turned back to Fraser, amazed, awed, bursting with questions. Madman he may be, but he had wrought a miracle.
"I will explain," he said, and his eyes gleamed with pride. "Of course you know of my tremendous discoveries connected with the power of light. At any rate, 5 years ago the scientific world on Earth thought they were tremendous. In reality, that was nothing to my amazing strides in the past 3 years. There is nothing that cannot be done with light. Nothing!"
For the first time, Fraser's eyes became alive. They were illumined. His whole body seemed to radiate light and fire and genius. We listened, fascinated.
"Take, for instance," he continued eagerly, "that ray with which I drew you in your plane to me. That ray is the pure power of magnetism. At full strength, it will draw anything to it instantly. Fortunately, the power can be regulated. I can switch a lever in my laboratory and draw things to me. Via the ray, at any speed I wish, 100, 200, 1,000 miles an hour." "How far can you throw the ray?"
asked Foulet, and I knew he was thinking of that glider that rose from the rooftops of Constantinople. Fraser also knew he was thinking of that.
"I did not draw the glider," he said quietly. "The airplane I sent did that. My airplanes carry batteries of this ray. In the beginning I found gliders to be more practical for my purposes than airplanes. For one thing, they were silent. My only problem was that of getting them off the ground. Once they were in the air, I could manage everything. It was this problem that inspired this discovery and perfection of the ray. But you asked how far I can throw the ray. This main lamp that I operate myself from here is effective at 200 miles. At 100 miles it enjoys full power. And you can draw anything to you, asked Bryce, within the radius of the magnetic ray. Anything in the air, answered Fraser. But, of course, I must use caution. Great caution. If I drew planes to me indiscriminately, I would draw attention to myself. My secret and my location here would leak out. No, that must not be. So the only planes I bring are my own, and yours. He paused, and his black eyes, again glassy, swept over us. It is a compliment I pay you, he said finally. You have become too troublesome. You know too much. Sooner or later the time would come when you would combine your forces. That would be a nuisance. So I decided to bring you here. Suppose, asked Foulet curiously, we hadn't fallen into your trap. Suppose we had turned back before reaching the point where your ray is effective. Fraser shook his head, and that smug, offensive smile appeared again. You were trapped from the beginning, though you didn't know it, he said. The plane you were following was equipped with batteries of the ray, which, while not as powerful as the lamp I have here, were still powerful enough to hold you to the course we chose you to run. But enough of the ray, he added impatiently. There are one or two other things I want to explain, and then... He paused, and the pause somehow was alive with menace. What was he going to do after he had finished treating us as honored guests? For the third time he answered my unspoken question. His eyes narrowed till they were black, glittering slits. His voice, as he leaned toward us, was no more than a hissing whisper. Slaves, he said, and his lips twisted. How will you like to be slaves of Mad Algie Fraser? He laughed, a chuckle that started in his throat and rose till it seemed to shatter my eardrums. I felt my teeth grinding together, and my nails bit my palms in my effort to control my nerves against the strain of that maniacal glee. Suddenly he sobered. His laugh died instantly, like a radio that had been snapped off. Listen, and I will tell you. I will tell you everything because it is necessary for you to know, so that you may work for me intelligently, and you will remember better and be of greater use to me if I tell you now, while you are yet sane. Sane! The exclamation sprang from the three of us simultaneously. I felt a cold chill start between my shoulder blades. For an instant my breath choked in my throat. My heart paused, and then raced. What did he mean? What was he going to do to us? What scheme had he evolved in his crazy brain? I have perfected a serum. His tone was professional, cold. He might have been talking to a class in a lecture room. A serum that robs the patient of every vestige of human emotion, and therefore sanity. All his intellect, his memories, however, remain to serve him carrying out my orders. He loses all his will to live and resist, and becomes nothing but an automaton, whose complete mental equipment is at my command. There was silence. His glassy black eyes, blank and soulless, swept over us. His mouth curled in that smug, complacent smile. He had us with our shoulders to the floor. He knew it, and he knew we knew it. There was no possible way we could escape. We were 2,000 feet above the earth. Our plane wouldn't get a quarter of a mile before the magnetic ray would bring it back. Parachute? Even supposing we could get parachutes, where would we go? Drop 2,000 feet into the middle of the Arabian desert? My brain raced. Never before had I been in such a tight place. And soon, if Fraser had his way, I wouldn't even have a mind to think with. I felt choked, stifled. Was there no way out? It seemed to me that a blanket, a soft, terrible blanket of uncontrollable circumstance, was being folded around me, robbing me of the use of my limbs, paralyzing me, numbing me. And out of this great helplessness came again Fraser's voice. I have told you enough, he said suavely, so that you may have a faint idea of my power. I will send you now to Dr. Simple, who will administer the serum and place you under the nourishment ray. This is another of my discoveries.
he added casually.
It is a ray which allows the patient to absorb through the shell of his skin sufficient nourishment, both solid and liquid, to last for 24 hours.
5 minutes later, we stood in a small room that might have been the office of an up-to-date physician anywhere in the world. Across the polished top of a mahogany desk, Dr. Simple stared at us, his eyes, like the eyes of our guide and Fraser, polished and expressionless. But now we understood. Those eyes were expressionless because there was nothing to give them expression. I tried to force my mind to comprehend the almost incomprehensible. We were among men who were not men. We were fast in the power of human beings who possessed no trace of humanity, who had become nothing but scientific robots, even though they still had bodies of flesh and blood. It was unbelievable. My hands grew cold and my brain hot at the thought. Yet, gazing into the bright enameled eyes of Dr. Simple, I knew it was true. Carefully, scientifically, we were prepared for our injections. And with every mechanical move of the doctor, my mind seemed to take on fresh speed as it raced toward some solution to our terrible problem. My eyes flew around the tiny office, searching for some means of escape. Dr. Simple turned to prepare the syringe. Behind his back, Bryce gestured frantically. Somehow I understood. In my pocket was a flask I had filled with drinking water in Constantinople. Bewildered, I handed it over to him. The doctor turned, swabbed a patch of iodine on our arms, reached for the syringe. As he leaned over, Foulet thrust forward a foot. The doctor tripped, sprawled full length on the floor. Foulet and I quickly stooped to pick him up, standing between him and Bryce, shielding his eyes so that he could not see. We fumbled to give Bryce time. We apologized and soothed. Out of the tail of my eye, I could see Bryce working like lightning, emptying out the syringe of that villainous liquid, filling it with clear water. It was done. We raised the doctor to his feet, gave his clothes a final brush. But as we stood back, I know my hands were trembling, and I had to clamp my teeth to keep them from chattering. Were we out of danger yet? Would the doctor discover our ruse? And if we got out of his office without receiving the terrible injection, could we successfully fool Fraser and his slaves into believing we were mad? Fool them until we got a chance to escape? Could we simulate that glassy stare? Were we sufficiently good actors to get away with it? The questions pounded and raced through my brain in that instant when Dr. Simple turned again to his desk and picked up the syringe. But the miracle happened. Mechanically, he gave us the injection, never suspecting that it was not the devilish liquid he had put in, but only clear water. Then he stepped back and watched us. Cold chills raced up and down my spine. What were we supposed to do now? What was the action of the serum? Did it act at once or slowly? Was it supposed to make us sick? Did it send us to sleep? How could we simulate symptoms when we had no idea what these symptoms were supposed to be? But the cold voice of the doctor cut sharply across my agonized questions.
"You will lie down here,"
he said, opening a door into a room whose trails were lined with bunks, like an opium den.
"In half an hour I will come for you. By that time—"
His lips spread in that same travesty of a smile Fraser had employed. We filed into the room, and the door closed behind us. Obediently, we lay down on the narrow bunks. We dared not speak. We scarcely dared glance at each other. We must act at all times as if we were observed. Might not Fraser have a ray that could penetrate walls? Might he not even now know that we had outwitted the doctor and had not received the fatal injection? And what then? Suppose Fraser himself superintended another injection. I pulled my thoughts back from the terrible supposition. One thing at a time. So far, all had gone well. I lay down on the bunk and closed my eyes. Half an hour later, we heard the door open. Now, I thought, when I look up, I am supposed to be mad. I struggled to make my mind a blank. I tried to force into my eyes that peculiar, brilliant, shiny, vacant expression I had noticed. Would I succeed? I raised my eyes. The doctor was standing before us. With a gesture, he bade Foulet go to him. I watched beneath lowered lids. Thank God he had called Foulet first. Foulet had dabbled in the psychology of insanity. Foulet would know how to act, and I would ape him. Coldly, mechanically, Dr. Simple ran him through a few tests. I watched with bated breath. The doctor nodded. Foulet had passed. It was my turn. I did exactly as Foulé had done, and succeeded. I had to turn away swiftly so that the doctor wouldn't see the gleam of triumph in my supposedly mad eyes. He motioned to Bryce, but just as Bryce stepped forward, the door opened and Fraser came into the room. For an instant, everything reeled. We were gone. But even in that terrible instant of despair, I remembered to keep my eyes blank. No trace of expression must appear, or we were lost. I stretched my lips in that travesty of a smile I had seen the others use. Fraser stared at us, one after the other. He nodded.
"It is well,"
he said, slowly and distinctly, as if he were talking to small children.
"Your names will still be as they were."
We stared at him blankly, and again he nodded.
"You have forgotten your names. Ah, yours," he pointed to me, "was Ainsley, and it still is. And you are Monsieur Foulé. But Bryce—"
He paused. My heart hung in my breast, suspended there with terror. What was the matter with Bryce? What did Fraser suspect, or know? He turned to the doctor.
"You will give Inspector Bryce another injection," he said. "The inspector has a strong mind and a clever one. A normal injection would not be enough."
It seemed to me that my blood froze. In that terrible instant it ran like tingling ice through my veins. Bryce, the brainiest man in Scotland Yard. For Fraser was right. Bryce had more brains than Foulé and I together. And in another half hour Bryce would be no better than an idiot. For I didn't fool myself. Even Bryce couldn't outwit Dr. Simple twice.
"You will follow me," said Fraser, turning to Foulé and me. "I will put you under the nourishment ray while Dr. Simple attends to Bryce."
Obediently, with slightly shuffling gait and vacant eyes, we followed him into an adjoining room, leaving Bryce behind. I didn't even trust myself to glance at him as we left, but my heart was in my boots. When would we see him again, and what would he be? The room we entered was dark, but instantly Fraser switched on a mellow orange-colored light that flooded the room with a deep warm glow.
"Strip yourselves and sit down,"
he said, pointing to deep lounging chairs that filled the room.
"You will do nothing. Relax and allow the light to bathe you. In half an hour I will come back with instructions."
We obeyed, I imitating blindly every vague, mechanical movement of Foulé's. We settled ourselves in the comfortable chairs, and Fraser left us. He had told us to relax, but to do anything else would have been impossible. The light soothed us, eased us, gave us, somehow, a penetrating sensation of peace and complete comfort. It flowed around us, warming us, lulling us to a delicious dreamy state that was neither waking nor sleeping. It wiped out danger. It wiped out time. Nothing existed but this warm and relaxing sensation of utter satisfaction and peace. Through this mist of contentment came Fraser's voice.
"That is all."
The light faded gradually, and as gradually we came to ourselves.
"You will dress,"
directed Fraser in the same clear-clipped manner,
"and you will come to me in my laboratory."
15 minutes later we stood before him, vacant-eyed and solemn. Fraser fastened his black polished eyes upon us.
"You will tell me," he said distinctly, "all you know."
We were silent. How could we tell him all we knew when we were supposed to have forgotten everything? Was this a trap? Or did our inside Secret Service information come under the general head of science? But before these questions had actually formed in my mind, I remembered that several times Fraser had answered my questions before they were asked. Might he be a mind reader? Best to take no chances. I made my conscious mind as blank as possible and gazed back at him. At my side, Foulé made a vague and uncertain noise in his throat.
"Your countries are afraid of me."
Fraser leaned forward, that smug, vain smile curling his lips.
"Your countries know there is a power abroad stronger than they. They feel that between the twin horns of economic pressure and the red menace they will be tossed to destruction."
"Destruction?" repeated Foulé with all the vacant inflection of idiocy. "Tossed?" I asked, imitating Foulé. But instantly I wondered if we were taking the right tack, for Fraser's eyes grew red with fury.
"Answer me!" he raged. Tell me that your countries know that soon I shall be master of the world. Tell me they are afraid of me. Tell me that in the last 3 years I have slowly gained control of commerce, of gold. Tell me they know I hold the economic systems of the world in the hollow of my hand. Tell me that not a government on earth but knows it is hanging on the brink of disaster. And I put it there. My agents spread the propaganda of ruin. My agents crashed your Wall Street and broke your banks. I, Mad Algie Fraser!
He stopped, gasping for breath. His face was scarlet. His eyes glowed like red coals. Suddenly he burst into a cascade of maniacal laughter, high, insane, terrible. It took all my control to keep my eyes blank, my face devoid of expression. Out of the tail of my eye, I saw Foulet smiling, a vague, idiotic smile of sympathy with Fraser's glee. But suddenly the glee died, as suddenly as if a button had snapped off the current. He leaned forward, his black eyes devouring our faces.
They are afraid of me?
It was a whisper, sharply eager.
The world knows I am master.
Master, repeated Foulet. It wasn't quite a question, yet neither was it sufficiently definite as an answer to arouse Fraser's suspicions. To my relief, it satisfied him. The congested blood drained out of his face. His eyes lost their glare. He turned and for several minutes tramped up and down the laboratory, lost in thought. At last he came back to us.
I have changed my mind, he muttered. Come with me.
Without a word, we followed him, out through the door and down the passageway. Out of the building he led us. The air was stirring with the first breath of dawn, and along the horizon glowed a band of pure gold where the sun would soon rise. When he had walked some 30 yards from the laboratory, Fraser paused. With his toe he touched a spring in the platform. A trap door instantly yawned at our feet. I suppressed a start just in time, but through my body shot a thrill of fear. My muscles tensed, my heart raced. What now? Where could a trap door 2,000 feet above the earth lead? Was he going to shove us into space because we refused to answer his questions?
Go down,
Fraser ordered. For the space of a breath we hesitated. To disobey meant certain and instant death at the hands of this soulless maniac. But to obey, to drop through this trapdoor, also meant death. I took a step forward. Could we overpower him? But what if we did? There were others here besides Fraser. How many others I had no idea, but surely enough to make things impossible for Foulet and me. Yet we dared not even hesitate. To hesitate implied thinking, and a man robbed of his brain cannot think. There was no way out. Together, Foulet and I stepped to the brink of the yawning hole. For an instant we were almost blinded by a glare of rosy light that seemed to burst upon us from the earth so far below. Here was the source of that strange afterglow. Away beneath us, evidently on the sands of the Arabian desert, glowed 4 red eyes, sending forth the rosy rays that converged at the center of the floating platform. Instantly, I comprehended Fraser's scheme. The fluotite he had invented, and of which the platform and buildings were made, was lighter than air. It followed, therefore, that if it were not anchored in some way, it would instantly rise. So Fraser had anchored it with 4 of his magnetic rays. He had told us that he could regulate the pulling power of the ray, so what he had obviously done was to calculate to a nicety the lift of the fluotite against the magnetism of the rays. But instantaneously with this thought came another. Fraser was urging us into the glow of the magnetic ray. If once our bodies came entirely within the ray, we would be yanked from the platform and dashed to death, sucked to destruction on the sands below. In my ear I heard Fraser's fiendish chuckle.
The instinct of fear still holds, eh? My serum can destroy your conscious mind, but not your native fear? Cowards! Fools! But I am not going to push you off. Look!
With his foot he pressed another lever, which, while it did not shut off any of the light, seemed to deflect the ray.
Fools! He said again scornfully. Go down!
Then it was I saw where he was sending us. 30 feet below the platform there swung a small cabin, attached by cables and reached by a swinging steel ladder. As I looked, a door in the roof slid back. "Climb down!" ordered Fraser again. There was nothing to do but obey. Accustomed as I was to flying, inured as I had become to great heights, my head reeled and my hands grew icy as I swung myself through that trap door and felt for a footing on the swinging ladder. Suppose Fraser turned the ray back on us as we climbed down. Suppose he cut the ladder. But instantly my good sense told me he would do neither. If he had meant to kill us, he could have done it easier than this. No, somewhere in his mad head he had a reason for sending us down to this swinging cabin. 5 minutes later, Foulet and I stared at each other in the cramped confines of our prison. The tiny door in the roof, through which we had dropped, was closed. The steel ladder had been pulled up. We were alone. Alone? Were there no eyes that watched us still, or ears that listened to what we might say? Foulet evidently shared my sense of espionage, for, without even glancing at me, he laid down on the hard floor of our bare little cabin and, to all intents and purposes, fell asleep. For a few minutes I stood staring at him, then followed his example. As I relaxed, I realized I was tremendously weary. The cumulative exhaustion of the past 36 hours seemed to crowd upon me with a smothering sense of physical oppression. I looked at my watch and wound it. 5 o'clock. Through the narrow slits near the roof of our swinging cell I could see the changing light of dawn, melting in with the rosy glow from the magnetic rays. My eyelids drooped heavily. When I awoke, Foulet was standing near me, his arms folded across his chest, scowling thoughtfully. He nodded as he saw my open eyes, but when I started to speak, he shook his head sharply. With his gesture, there flooded back to me the feeling that we were watched, even through the walls of our aerial prison and the floor of the platform above us. I sat up and, clasping my knees with my hands, leaned against the wall. There must be a way out of this for us. All my life I had worked on the theory that if you thought hard enough, there was a way out of any difficulty. But this seemed so hopeless. No matter how hard we thought, the mad mind of Fraser would always be one jump ahead of us. And maybe we didn't dare even think. If Fraser were able to read minds, as I was nearly sure he was, then hadn't we better keep our minds blank even down here? But an instant's thought showed me the flaw in my logic. Fraser could, without much doubt, read minds, when those minds were close to him. If he could read minds at a distance, then he wouldn't need to ask us for information. But why had he put us here? I burrowed around for an answer. Had he guessed we had outwitted Dr. Simple and not taken the mad serum after all? And was this punishment? No. If Fraser had guessed that, he would simply have given us more serum, as he had with Bryce. Bryce. Where was poor Bryce now? Was he an idiot, with blank face and shiny, soulless eyes? My mind shuddered away from the thought, taking refuge in my first question. Why were we here? What was Fraser going to do with us? We lost all track of time. In spite of my winding it, my watch stopped and the hours slipped by uncounted. Night came, and another dawn, and another night. Twice our roof was lifted and our tiny swinging cell filled with the orange light of the nourishment ray. But we saw no one, nor did anyone speak to us. The third day passed in the same isolated silence. Occasionally, Foulet or I would utter a monosyllable. The sound of our voices was comforting, and the single words would convey little to a listener. But as the hours of the third night slowly passed, the atmosphere in our tiny swinging cell grew tense. Something was going to happen. I could feel it, and I knew that by Foulet's eyes that he felt it too. The air was tight, electrical. Standing on tiptoe, I glued my eyes to the narrow slit, which was our only ventilation. But I could see nothing. The brilliant rosy glow blinded me. I couldn't even see the huge platform floating above our heads. Then, suddenly, our roof slid back. The magnetic ray was deflected. Above us, in the opening of the trap door, leered the bright, mad eyes of Fraser. "Good evening," he said mockingly. "How do you feel?" We smiled hesitantly. Something in his voice made me feel he was addressing us as sane men and not idiots. But why? Weren't we supposed to be idiots when he put us down there? "You ought to feel all right," Fraser went on critically. "The first dose of that serum lasts only 3 days. It's cumulative. he added with his professional air. "In the beginning, an injection every 3 days, then once a week, and so on. There's a man who has been with me for 3 years who needs treatment only once every 3 months. Well, are you ready to talk?" So that was it. He had put us down here till the supposed effects of that serum had worn off, and now we were to talk, tell him everything his agents had been risking their lives to find out. We were to sell out our countries to him, betray all the secrets we had sworn by eternity to keep. If we did as he demanded, both France and the United States would be at his mercy, and he had no mercy. He was not a man. He was a cruel, power-loving, scientific machine. I clamped my teeth. Never would I talk. I had sworn to protect my country's secrets with my life, and my vow would be kept. "You will talk?" Fraser asked again, his voice suddenly suave and beseeching. "For those who talk there are rewards." "Let down the ladder," said Foulet, in a quiet conversational tone. "It will be easier to discuss this." Fraser's eyes narrowed to gleaming slits. He smiled craftily. "The ladder will be let down when you talk." "And if," suggested Foulet, "we don't wish to talk?" Fraser's lips stretched in a wider grin. His white teeth gleamed. His shiny black eyes glittered. In that warm, rosy light, he looked like a demon from hell. He held out his hand. In it shone a long, slender instrument. "This knife," he said softly, "will cut the steel cables that connect you to this platform, as if they were cheese. You will talk?" Beside me, I heard Foulet gasp. Swiftly, my imagination conjured up the picture of our fate. Our determined refusal to divulge the secrets of our respective countries, the severing one by one of our 4 cables holding us to the platform, the listing of our swinging cell, the tipping, the last terrible plunge 2,000 feet. But it would be swift. The power of the magnetic ray would give us no time to think, to suffer. It would be a merciful end. "Let us up," bargained Foulet. "We will talk." Fraser laughed. "None of that," he said slyly. "You talk from there, and if your information doesn't dovetail with what I already know—" He flourished the steel knife suggestively. We were caught. No amount of bluff would save us now. Fraser demanded that truth, facts, actual information, and he wouldn't be fooled by anything spurious. Foulet's shoulder touched mine as we peered up through the roof of our cell at our mad captor. We spoke together. "There is nothing to say." The assured smile left Fraser's lips. His eyes glittered red. His whole mad face was contorted with fury. A volley of oaths poured through his twisted mouth. With a gesture of insane rage, he pulled the nearest cable to him and slashed it with the knife. Our cell tilted. Foulet and I were thrown into a heap on the floor. We sprang up to face Fraser again through the roof. His mad eyes glared down at us, soul-chilling, maniacal. "Talk!" he snarled. "Talk, or I'll slice another!" He drew the second cable to him, holding it in readiness. I clenched my teeth. Beside me, I could see the muscles of Foulet's jaw working. Talk? Never. "Talk!" screamed Fraser. "Talk!" Our silence and our white faces were his only answer. There was a gleam of the knife in the rosy light. Our cell lurched, quivered, then caught. Would it hold with only 2 cables? It was hanging on its side. We were standing on what had been the wall. Through the opening in the roof we could see nothing but rosy light and distant stars. How strong were the cables? Could they hold against the pull of the magnetic ray? We could feel the pull now, feel the strain on the cables above us. If Fraser cut the 3rd one... "Talk!" His voice came hoarse with fury. "Talk now! You can't see me," he went on, "but I'm pulling the 3rd cable toward me. I'm raising the knife. Will you talk?" Standing on that quaking wall, Foulet and I stared at each other. How long would it be? 1 second? Half a minute? Thank God it would be quick. This was the worst now. This eternity of waiting. "I'm cutting it!" yelled Fraser. And with his words, the cell lurched, swung, whirled like a spinning top. Foulet and I were tossed around like dried peas in a pod. Suddenly the thing steadied. 2 steel hooks were clamped on the edge of the opening in what had been the roof, and Bryce stared at us through the aperture.
"Quick," he gasped. "There's not a second to lose. Don't stare. Quick, I say. I've got the ladder here. It's steel and it'll hold. Climb up."
Dumbly we obeyed. Our heads were whirling, our bodies bruised and mashed by the shaking up. Blindly, dizzily, we climbed up the ladder, scrambled out onto the platform. Solid footing again. As Bryce loosed the ladder and pulled it up, there was a snap. The last cable had gone. The cell shot down to earth with a speed that must have reduced it to a powder. Foulet and I stared after it, dazed, unbelieving. Bryce's whisper hissed in our ears.
"Listen carefully."
He gripped our shoulders.
"I'm not mad. They shot the stuff into me, but I found an antidote in Simple's office and used it right away. Now, listen to me. Our plane is over there."
He pointed across the platform.
"It's all ready to take off. They think they're sending me off on an errand for them at dawn. It's ready for a long trip. Go there, get in, and if anyone questions you, tell them it's orders. They won't, though. No one gives orders here but Fraser."
Bryce nodded toward a dark heap beside the trap door.
"You killed him?"
asked Foulet.
"Stunned him," said Bryce. "He may come to at any moment, and if he does—"
"Suppose we bind him and take him in the plane," I suggested. Bryce shook his head.
"Leave him here. It's safer. Now, go. Get in the plane and take off."
"And not wait for you?" I gasped. "You're crazy."
"I'll be there. You can pick me up later. There's no time to explain, but you'll know. Take off, then circle around and come back. But watch out."
He gave us both a shove toward the plane, the dim shadow of which we could see across the platform. We took a step toward it and then turned back. How could we go without Bryce? But he had vanished, and in the shadow of the trap door, Fraser groaned. We waited no longer. To hesitate was to court death. Deliberately, as if we were acting under orders, we walked toward the plane. As Bryce had said, it was in readiness. Evidently, he was to have started at once. We climbed in, our hearts in our throats. A mechanic stepped forward. The propeller roared. But above the roar of the propeller, we heard a yell of fury. And Fraser, dazed and reeling, came stumbling across the platform toward us. Foulet took the controls. The plane taxied across the platform, swooping into space. But it was not till it had risen and steadied that I realized the complete idiocy of our forlorn hope of escape. What fools we were. And Bryce. Bryce must, in truth, be mad. How could we get away? How could we ever escape the terrific power of the magnetic ray? That ray that Fraser worked himself from his laboratory. The ray that had drawn us first across the desert to this floating island of madness. It would be a matter of seconds before Fraser would reach it and turn it on us. There was no escape. None. In despair, I looked back at the platform. To eyes ignorant of its horror, it would have been an amazing and gorgeous sight. The crimson lamps of the magnetic ray bloomed like huge desert flowers on the sand 2,000 feet below us. The rays flamed up with the glory of an Italian sunset, and, poised in space like a dark butterfly, floated the huge platform bathed in its rosy light. It was beautiful. It was unbelievable. It was horrible. I gazed, fascinated. When would Fraser reach the lamp? When would he turn it on? I stared at the dark shadow that I knew was the laboratory building. My eyes strained through the growing distance. When would the glow come? That glow that meant our death. Suddenly I gasped. The light had gone. The great lamps down on the desert floor were out. Darkness, swift, comforting, wrapped us in velvet folds.
"Bryce!" I yelled. "Bryce has cut off the lamps! He's released the platform! God! Look! Foulet!"
My voice tore through my throat. My eyes burned with sudden, blinding emotion. In the soft darkness of the starry night, I could see the platform waver, topple, rise. It rose straight up, tilting and swaying in the light breeze. What was it Fraser had said? If it was released, it would go straight to the stars. It was on its way. But Bryce? Where was Bryce? Was he on that terrible rising island? I strained my eyes through the darkness. Already Foulet had banked the plane. We were circling, turning back. A tiny white speck took shape beneath the rising island. A parachute. Bryce was safe. 10 minutes later, we slid along the hard desert sand and came to a stop. Bryce came running over toward us. Foulée and I climbed out of the plane to meet him. Silently, we gripped hands. It was a solemn moment. Beside us reared the great plane that would take us back to safety, back to the familiar life we knew and loved. Around us stretched the trackless wastes of the great Arabian desert, and above, somewhere between us and the stars, soared the floating island of madness.
"They believed I was mad," said Bryce as we climbed back into the plane. "I watched Fraser. I spied on the men. There were about 30 up there, and finally I saw where they regulated those lamps. The rest was easy, all except the minute when I found Fraser kneeling beside that trap door slicing the cables. For a second I thought it was all up."
"You got us just in time," I muttered. "But you can't be grateful with an Englishman. They won't stand for it."
"Oh, bosh,"
Bryce murmured, as the plane swung its nose toward that far distance that was home.
"Well, it's all over, but it's a story that can never be told. The fate of Mad Fraser will have to remain a mystery, for no one would believe us if we told them."
End of The Floating Island of Madness by Jason Kirby.
The Dream of Death by Elwood F. Pierce. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Candra Robinson. The Dream of Death by Elwood F. Pierce. The queer figure of a man sat deep in the chair in full repose. His eyes, unusually sharp, were now listless and just a little sleepy as he watched the crackling fire. He felt a chilly draft at his back, and immediately there was the click of a door closing softly, after which feet shuffled across the floor. Unconsciously, Anderson Brenton, psychologist, sucked at his empty pipe. The intruder moved to the log fire, holding his shaky hands to the blaze, and shiveringly seated himself on a stool Professor Brenton had been using as a footrest. The man who thus for a moment had startled Brenton was the half-witted brother of his landlady. 2 nights before, the little psychologist had rented the room on the 3rd floor front, and as he bargained with Mrs. Thompson, he noticed the actions of the demented one. The landlady had said her brother was harmless, and Brenton did not give him thought. "What are you doing here?" the lodger asked sharply, now that the brief sensation of fright had passed. "I thought it was understood that I was not to be disturbed. What do you want?" The psychologist's brows were shaggy, and so was his beard. He was a shaggy person, and being small, impressed one as a weakling physically. But his eyes were penetrating, combative, and he eyed his visitor fiercely. There was something utterly repulsive about the man who trembled in front of the fire. "Cold," the half-wit murmured. He shivered and turned anew to the blaze. "Cold." His body was shaking. Professor Brenton, contributor to the cause of science, might have found it hard to explain why he was occupying the 3rd floor front room. Perhaps it was because once in a while he liked to get away from daily college and to pursue certain of his studies uninterrupted. The room on the 3rd floor had been advertised for rent, and he had taken it. That was all. Almost immediately, he recognized in Gus Aker an interesting subject. But until the moment the old man shuffled into his room and complained of the cold, it had not occurred to the psychologist to attempt a mental investigation. But this was the beginning. Brenton noted the apparent harmlessness of the man and was interested. Then, casting into the half-wit's mind with questions that served as primary experiments, he became fascinated. Later, his tests were tedious and delicate, and afforded him an opportunity of determining the worth of certain theories he recently had developed, theories which were disputed by his scientific associates. Perhaps from a humane standpoint, Brenton was a bit cruel, but his examinations, at least, were in the spirit of the botanist who studies a rare flower. The psychologist learned that the man's intellect, unable to hold anything of itself, was keenly awake to the workings of the minds of others. He found that virtually without effort he could transfer his thoughts to the witless creature, and the man would respond in a manner all but normal, and as if the thought were his own. But no thought was retained. Gus Aker's mind reached out and fed on the intelligence of others. But the moment the thought had been transformed into action, he again became an imbecile, with blankness of mind equal to that of a cleanly wiped slate. Of one thing Professor Brenton was certain. This was not hypnotism, nor did his power over the half-wit have any relation to hypnotism. For many nights, Aker was subjected to examination and new tests. Brenton dug deep and without mercy, in the hope that he might unearth the reason for the hidden phenomena. At first there was no explanation, but he found out much during his hours of research, and finally came to the most important discovery of all. It was a cold night in December, and Professor Brenton was seated in his easy-chair. That was 2 weeks after Gus Aker first appeared in his room. Suddenly Brenton perceived that his fire was out, all that remained in the grate being some dying embers. Grumbling, he arose and slipped on his great coat, reflecting almost unconsciously, "I wish Gus Aker would bring up some wood." Shivering, he resumed his reading. A few minutes later there was a scraping outside his door, and Aker entered with an armload of fuel. He dropped the sticks by the fireplace and stared vacantly at the little professor. There was the usual look of dumb terror, after which his eyes grew listless, and he seemed to wonder at his surroundings. "Who told you to bring up the wood?" Brenton asked. Aker mumbled, rolled his eyes, and left the room without attempting to reply. Apparently, he did not understand the question. Brenton listened to the man's retreating steps, shrugged his shoulders, and kneeling, built a new fire. He was disturbed by this new and uncanny power, but it opened a curiously marvelous field for him. He might, after all, be able to prove his theory that the mind is never a free agent. An hour later, still deep in thought, he turned to his window overlooking a plot of ground that in summer was a rose garden. Now there was snow on the ground, the bushes that abounded being slightly tinctured with white. The professor noticed a shifty figure emerge from the shadow of the house and move aimlessly among the sleeping bushes with their ghostly shrouds. It was Gus Aker, poor, hopeless, demented Gus Aker. Curious to give his power farther trial, the psychologist permitted himself to wish for the presence of Gus Aker in the room with him. Almost instantly, the figure below straightened, and a startled face was raised to the window before which Brenton stood. Then the man went indoors. He did not move hastily, but in his slow shuffling manner, as if he had finished his walk in the garden and was returning to the house under a natural impulse. Brenton still stood at the window marveling. Then the door opened, and he knew what that meant. The imbecile, would do whatever the professor willed that he should do. Without the practice of hypnotism, the psychologist was able to unite his mind with the mind of Gus Aker and control his actions. All that was necessary to bring this about was the barest thought. "Why don't you knock when you come in?" Brenton demanded. Aker did not reply but shuffled his weight from one foot to the other, then turned and left the room. But the professor had done no more than wish for his presence, and any desire that he may have had for the man to remain was only negative in value. The reaction of Gus Aker was merely positive, and very naturally so. After that, Brenton was to experience a sensation of fear. He wanted to halt the experiments, and indeed did make an attempt to do so, but found, just as he had feared, that he rapidly was coming under the influence of a mind that one almost could say did not exist. Yet it weakened him, sapped his energy day by day, did this mental intercourse with a vacant brain. There were even times when Brenton found it difficult to breathe, and thinking was not always easy. He began, when it was too late, to realize that he was to be penalized for his unnatural experiments. The little professor was suffering from nerves. Perhaps it was old age creeping on, he told himself, casting about for an excuse. Could it be that the imbecile was making demands upon him, eating into his brain? And then, there was his vitality low at ebb. His capacity for work had decreased, and it was difficult for him to concentrate, even on his reading. It's time I was ending this vacation, Brenton decided. I must get back to the old routine. Enough of this foolishness. But he could not leave. Very rapidly indeed, his own mind and the mind of Gus Aker were merging, and his own mind slowly was being sucked away. All but helpless, Brenton began to be concerned for his own sanity. At last he came to fear Aker, to dread the sight of him, and yet a dozen times a day he found it necessary to call the imbecile to his room, much to the discomfort of the landlady, who was unable to understand anything that would suggest a friendship between the queer little scientist in the front room on the third floor and her witless brother. It wasn't reasonable, she interpreted. The end came at last. Brenton, suddenly aroused, sat up in the old-fashioned bed that formed no mean part of the furnishings of the room. His body was clammy, and he was gripped by a fear of the unknown. Brenton, a brave man, as shown by his experiments covering many years, seemed to sense that mighty fingers were at his throat. He had been dreaming, and what a dream! He had seen Gus Aker creeping up the stairs, a long kitchen knife in his hand. The half-witted creature had stood over him, and then... It had been at this point that the psychologist awoke, just as the knife was descending. A few minutes later, he was calmer, and did succeed, to a degree, in putting aside his fears. He pulled the covers over his shoulders, for it was cold and the log fire was now only so much ashes. Footsteps outside his room, boards creaking, a hand fumbling at the door swinging open, a shaft of moonlight penetrating the room and falling upon the figure that crouched in the doorway, just as it had been seen to do in the dream a few minutes before. Brenton screamed. The thought whirled through his mind that he was helpless. The action of his dream was such that the witless man would carry it out. He was trembling too, and his eyes burned into his head like torches that flamed in white heat. The figure crossed the floor, still crouching. there was the glitter of the long kitchen knife. Brenton's effort to gain control of the mind of Gus Aker was futile. He knew what he must do to save himself, but the mental effort that would control the man was impossible of accomplishment. He struggled like one seeking to arouse himself from a nightmare. The figure crept upon him, slowly, and with a great show of stealth. The scientist could hear the man's short breathing, see the very gleam of his eyes as the moonbeams shot into his face. The boards of the floor creaked, and the sound was not like anything Brenton had ever heard before. It made him think of a bat beating its wings against the walls of a tomb. A single thought, a moment of mental action, would change the course of the half-wit's movements. But the psychologist knew that his mind had been sucked dry, and that the man creeping upon him was the one who now held the scepter of power. Anderson Brenton was as one paralyzed, and he could only watch Gus Aker approach with the long knife in his hand, the moonbeams falling upon his purple face, just as in the dream. One last scream. The next morning, the witless man was found by his sister, asleep on the floor of the front room on the 3rd floor. There was a kitchen knife in his hand, a long knife stained with blood, and Brenton, who had not been able to will that Gus Aker should not carry out his unfortunate dream, was dead. End of The Dream of Death by Elwood F. Pierce.
True to Type by Arthur T. Harris. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. True to Type by Arthur T. Harris. Pascal Halmer had a superficial talent, and he was smart. You'd never find him rewriting a theme that had appeared, say, 5 or 10 years before, in a popular monthly. He was too smart for that. But Halmer would haunt the second-hand magazine stalls and buy a pile of fiction publications published 10 to 20 years ago. Then, back in his dingy furnished room, he'd uncork a bottle of cheap brandy, roll a smoke, and settle back to read. Presently he would chuckle, rip out the sheets he had read, and do some pencil work on them. Then he'd seat himself before me and begin typing the pilfered plot, twisting it about in such a fashion that plagiarism would be extremely difficult to prove. He'd change the locale, the sequence of events, all the names, retaining only the plot gimmick, the essence of the story. Now, I am not trying to pose a moral issue, for under the deft fingers of Pascal Halmer, I had, for the first time in my life, the feeling of creativeness, of originality of thought, aim, and purpose. Of course, I too was a fraud, but I told myself nobody knew our secret, and we entertained just as many readers as the more creative writers in the business. All my life I had been a hopeless drudge, used by bored typists in a little office where I was limited to legal papers, stencils for invoices, and such. Now I contributed to the pleasure of thousands of eager readers of escape fiction. Late in middle age I had found my niche in the creative world. Thus it was that my personality began to undergo a change. I came to think of myself as a colleague of Pascal Halmer, and as his friend, his confidant, did I not acquire certain proprietary rights? You can understand, then, how shocked I became when Halmer first began to neglect me. Little things, but they hurt. An instance was the afternoon when he came home with a brand-new FM radio receiver. Before long he became so absorbed in his recorded classics that he forgot to oil me, to change my ribbon, to put on my cover when he'd typed out 30 at the end of a story. I sulked. My keys began to stick. My ribbon grew smudgy and faded. But Halmer paid me no heed until he received a humorous little note from an editor one day. "Your yarns are tops," he read aloud, "but reading them has made me wear trifocals." With a muttered oath Halmer left our attic studio, returned with typewriter oil, a type brush, a new ribbon. But he didn't do this for love of me. He did it only to keep his editor happy, and that hurt. Naturally, my morale was affected. My keys began to rattle. My warning bell, to signal a line's end, became so inhibited that Halmer would curse when I failed to ring, and my platen began to crack. The climax came one afternoon when I had been particularly difficult to handle. Halmer finally banged my keyboard with his fist, picked up the phone, and dialed a number. Stunned, I listened as he said, "Acme Typewriter Service? This is Pascal Halmer, the writer. My old machine is on its last gasp. I need a new one. Oh, you have several new models on hand? Good. Send one over." The end. 30. Fini. My faded keys stared upward at Halmer. At all costs, I must regain his confidence. He must see me, must understand that I was more than just an old beat-up machine. And he did. My concentration gradually drew his eyes to me. Sardonic, amused, cynical, Halmer gazed down at me, his gray eyes cold and calculating. "You're the only one that knows the story of my struggles," he said. "With you, my hard days go. I am now an established writer. My stories now get top rates. You always were too slow and stodgy anyway. On a new machine I shall write better than ever." "That's what you think, my fine feathered friend," I thought, as my mood shifted violently from abject contrition to bitter anger. "That's what you think." Pascal Halmer had a plot to plagiarize that night. He ripped right along until 3 a.m, producing 5,000 neatly mortised words with my help for a men's magazine. He typed out 30 at the end of his stolen tale, but he couldn't think of a new title for the story. So he left page 1 in my carriage, where he had reinserted it, to write in the title. He yawned sleepily, muttered, "Hell with the title, I'll do it in the morning. Set the alarm clock for 9, deliver the script at 10. I waited until my feckless friend was drowned in gurgling snores. Then, taking a grip on my nerves, I steeled myself to perform an independent act such as I had never before dared to attempt. Of my own volition, I began to type. The alarm clock went off at 9 the next morning, and Halmer came grudgingly, stiffly awake. His eyes were bloodshot, his reflexes were down. Presently he walked stiffly across the room, stopped in front of me, and gazed at the title I'd written. The Brave Die Hard. Not brilliant, but a change from the title used originally on the story. The author's name that I had typed below the title made no impression on Halmer at all. He had been so sleep-dazed the night before that I was gambling on his being vague about details. "Of course," he muttered. "Fell asleep thinking I hadn't doped out a title. I guess I was too tired to register. But it's a pretty good title considering the state I was in." Hurriedly he gathered up the typescript, attached a clip, put the story in a manila envelope, and dashed off to see his editor. Now I had but to wait. A half hour before noon Halmer returned, his face haggard with fatigue, but his gray eyes alight with arrogance. After 2 stiff shots of brandy, he bent over me, waving before my type eyes a publisher's check for $250. "See," he sneered, "they raised my rate. At last I'm on my way. Tomorrow I'll trade you in on a new machine, move out of this crummy garret." He had another drink, then stretched out on his cot and was soon asleep. I waited. Late in the afternoon, as the sky grew gray and clouded, the phone rang. I tensed. Halmer woke up, fumbled for the desk lamp switch, uncradled the phone. "Yes?" he said sleepily, petulantly. "Oh, hello, Evans." He sat erect, his voice becoming polite, ingratiating. Evans was his editor, to whom he'd given the story I'd typed last night. "I don't quite follow you, old boy," Halmer stammered. Now Evans's angry voice was loud, and I could hear it too. "No? Well, I just wanted to tell you that The Brave Die Hard is just as good today as when it was first written 40 years ago." I thought Halmer would have a stroke. "But how? Why? What makes you suspect?" Now his voice was a shriek. "It's not the same story. It couldn't be. I wrote that story from scratch." "Then you didn't scratch hard enough," the phone sneered. "We found the original by checking through bound volumes in the public library. When the word gets around, you'll be skunk bait in the publishing business. And, incidentally, we've stopped payment on your check." I almost felt sorry for the poor fool. "But you can't do this to me," Halmer screamed. "It's a miserable coincidence. I challenge you to prove—" "If it's coincidence, how come the other guy's name appears in the byline?" "His name instead of mine?" His voice was incredulous. "Maybe you typed it subconsciously, Halmer, unless you've got an enemy in the house." The mocking voice hung up. Like a sleepwalker, Halmer cradled the phone. He stared at the check, still propped up on the desk where he'd left it. Suddenly he lunged for it, tore it to bits, flung the pieces on the floor. Then he threw himself on his bed and beat his fists against the wall. Wait till he gets over the first shock, I thought. Wait till he begins to think. It wasn't long before Halmer sprang from his cot, lurched across the room, and stopped in front of me. "You!" he shouted. "You mechanical Judas! Only you could have crossed me up!" With berserk strength he swept me up, stalked across the room again, and hurled me straight through the dormer window. There was a sharded crackle as the glass shattered. There was a much louder crash when I hit the flagstones in the courtyard alley, collapsed into a mass of twisted junk. Maybe I wasn't as smart as I thought. End of True to Type by Arthur T. Harris. Recording by Roger Melin.
Strangers to Straba by Carl Jacobi. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kaitlyn Vanadestine. Strangers to Straba by Carl Jacobi. They sat in Cap Barlow's house on the lonely planet Straba. It was early evening, and Straba's twin moons were slowly rising from behind the magenta hills. Outside the window lay Cap's golf course, a study in toadstool cubism, while opposite the flag of the 18th hole squatted the kid's ship. The kid had landed there an hour ago. He had introduced himself as Clarence Rain, fieldman for Triplanet Pharmaceutical, and had announced urbanely he had come to make a botanical survey, all of which mildly amused Cap Barlow. The kid was amused too. From the pilot book he had learned that Cap was the sole inhabitant of Straba, and he regarded him, and rightly so, as just another hermit nut who preferred the spatial frontiers to the regular walks of civilization. The old man packed and lit a meerschaum pipe. "Yes, sir," he said. "Efficiency, regulation, order. That's what's spoiling all life these days. Those addle-headed scientists aren't satisfied unless they can dovetail everything." Rain smiled, and in the pause that followed cast his eyes about the room. It was circular, and no attempt had been made to conceal its origin. The bridge house of some discarded space-going tug. Along the continuous wall ran a triple tier of bookshelves, but it seemed that most of the books lay scattered on the table, chairs, and floor. Above the shelves, the walls were decorated with several three-dimensional watercolors, pin-up girls in various stages of undress, and mounted trophies of the rather hideous games Straba provided. About this survey, the kid began. Only last month, Cat Barlow continued, unmindful of the interruption, a salesman stopped off here and wanted to sell me a gadget for my golf course. Said it would increase the gravitation over the fairways and prevent the ball from traveling any further than it does on Earth. He spat disgustedly. You'd think any fool would realize it's an ideal course that can offer a par 3 on a 1,000-yard hole. But Rain hadn't come this far to listen to the dissertations of an old man. He was tired from long hours of sitting at the console of his ship. He stood up warily. If you'll show me where I can stow my gear, he said, I think I'll turn in and get some sleep. I've got a lot to do tomorrow. For a week the kid didn't bother Cap at all. Each morning he went out with a reference book, a haversack, and a canteen, and he didn't show up again until dark. Cap didn't mention that Straba had been officially surveyed 10 years before, or that results of this survey had been practically negative as far as adding to the interplanetary pharmacopoeia went. If TriPlanet wanted to train its green personnel by sending them on a wild goose chase, that was all right with Cap. But the old man had one thing that interested young Rain, his telescope mounted in a domed observatory on the top floor. Every night Rain spent hours staring through that scope, sighting stars, marking them on the charts. Cap tried to tell him that those charts were as perfect as human intellect could make them. Rain had an answer for that too. Those charts are 3 years old, he said. In 3 years a whole universe could be created or destroyed. Take a look at this star in graph 5. I've been watching it, and the way it's acting convinces me there's another star, probably a wanderer, approaching it from here. He indicated a spot on the chart. He was efficient and persistent. He watched his star, checked and rechecked his calculation, and in the end, to Cap's amazement, sighted the wanderer almost exactly where he said it would be. That discovery only excited him more, and after that he spent an even greater amount of time in the observatory. Then late one night he came to the top of the stairs and called for Cap. Cap went up to the scope, and at first he didn't see anything. Then he did see it, a darker shadow against the interrupted starlight. It's a ship, the old man said. Rain nodded. My guess too. But what's it doing out of regular space lanes? You forgot you landed here yourself. Straba does occasionally attract a visitor. Her crew may need water or food. Rain shook his head. I had chopped in from asteroid Torella. This fellow seems to be coming from deep space. They continued to watch that approaching shadow, taking turns at looking through the scope. It seemed to take a long time coming, but finally there was a roar and a rush of air, and a black shape hurtled out of the eastern sky. The two men ran outside, where Cap began to curse volubly. The ship's anti-gravs were only partially on. It had hit hard, digging up 300 yards of the 16th fairway and completely ruined 2 greens. Then the dust cleared, and the two men stared. The ship was a derelict, a piece of space flotsam. There was no question about that. It was also a Sibella-style coach, one of the first Earth-made passenger freighters to utilize a power pile drive, designed when streamlining was thought to mean following the shape of a cigar. On her bow was a name, but meteorite shrapnel had partially obliterated the letters. Jingoes, said Rain. I never saw a ship like this before. She must be old, really old. The hatches were badly fused and oxidized, and it was evident that without a blaster it would be impossible to get in. Cap shrugged. Let her stay there, she said. I can make a dog leg out of the 15th and keep the course fairly playable, and if I get tired of seeing that big hulk out of my dining room window, I can always plant some python vines around the near side of her. Rain shook his head quickly. There's no telling what we may find inside. We've got to find an opening. He went over the ship like a squirrel looking for a nut. Back under her stern quarter, just abaft her implosion plates, he found a small refuse scuttle which seemed movable. He took drills and went to work on it. 3 hours later, the two men were inside. There was nothing unusual about the crew quarters or the adjoining storage space, but when they reached the control cabin, they stood and gaped. It was like entering a museum. The bulkheads were covered with queer glass dials and several panels of manual operating switches. The power pile conduits were shielded with lead, mind you, and the lighting was apparently done with some kind of fluorescent tubes bracketed to the ceiling. It brought Cap back to the time he was a kid and his grandfather told him stories and legends of the past. Just above the pilot's old-fashioned cosmoscope was a fancy metal plate with the ship's name stamped on it, Perseus. Do you know what ship this is? Demanded Cap excitedly. I can read, said Rain. But do you know its history? The story behind it? Rain shook his head without interest. Cap Barlow was still staring at the nameplate. Perseus here, pleaded slowly. It goes back to the first Triad Empire, when the planets of Earth, Venus, and Mars were grouped into an oligarchy, when Venus was still a frontier. Life there was pretty much a gamble in those days, and the oligarchs enforced strict laws and eugenics. They set up marriage boards, and all young men and women had to undergo physical and mental examinations. Couples were paired off only after scientific scrutiny. In other words, it was a cold-blooded system which had no regard for what we call love. The old man paused. Did you ever hear of Mason Stewart? He asked suddenly. Rain shook his head. As an individual, he's pretty well forgotten today, Cap said. I suppose you might call him a promoter. At any rate, he figured a way to make himself a few thousand extra credits. He got hold of 2 condemned passenger freighters, and with a flair for classical mythology, named them Perseus and Andromeda. Rain, listening, lit a cigarette and blew a shaft of smoke ceilingward. The Perseus was moored in North Venus, continued Cap, the Andromeda in the south. Stewart managed to spread the word that these 2 ships would be heading for Alpha Centauri to start a new colony. He also let it be known that the passenger list would be composed of couples who were in love with each other without scientific screening or examination. Well, what happened? Demanded Rain with an air of acute boredom. Cap bit off a piece of plugged tobacco. The rumor spread and burst on the 2 ships, sold for fabulous prices. Of course, the constabulary investigated, but that's where Stewart was clever. The couples were to be split up, all females in one ship, all men in the other. The constabulary warned them that it would take years to cross such an immense distance. Those were the days before the Wellington overdrive, of course. But the couples wouldn't listen, and the 2 ships took off. People of 3 worlds made a big fuss over them. The theme invaded the teletheater and the popular tape novels of the day. Newscasters went wild in their extravagant reports. And then the truth came out. Stewart got drunk and let slip the fact that the boosters on the 2 ships were absolutely worthless and capable of operating for only a short time. By then, the ships were several 100,000 miles beyond the system and out of radio range. Rescue ships were sent out but found nothing, though they went as far as they dared. Stewart was jailed and executed. That's the story of the Perseus. Rain nodded and ground his cigarette stub against a bulkhead. Let's get on with the examination, he said. They continued down the dark corridors, Rain leading the way with a magno search lamp. Some of the cabins were in a perfect state of preservation. Others were mere cubicles of rust and oxidation. Once Cap touched a chair which apparently had been made of wood or some other product. It dissolved into dust on the instant. This was the Perseus, the ship which had carried the male passengers of that strange and ancient argosy, but as yet they had come upon no skeletons or human remains. What then had happened to them? 5 minutes later they entered the captain's cabin and found the answer. On the metal desk, preserved in lignite, lay the rough log. Cap picked it up, opened it carefully, and began to read. January 21. All hands and passengers in good health, but God help us, booster reading 00. By radio we have learned that our sister ship, the Andromeda, is also without auxiliary power and adrift. Such a dual catastrophe would certainly argue for something other than coincidence. Our charts show an asteroid of sizable proportions to lie approximately midway between the 2 ships. Under ordinary circumstances, I would order the lifeboats run out at once and attempt to reach this planetoid, hoping that by some miracle it will be capable of supporting life, but the circumstances are far from ordinary. We sighted them at 4:30 p.m. Earth time, a few moments after the booster went dead and the ship lost steerage way. Absorbers. They hover out there in space, clearly visible through the ports, waiting for us to open the airlock. There are 2 of them, but even as I write, one has turned and with unfailing accuracy is headed in the direction of the Andromeda. Absorbers. What a world of myth and legend surround them. Are they organic or inorganic? I do not know. I only know that they have been mortally feared by sailors since the first rocket blasted through Earth's orbit. They are what their name implies, devourers of life, with the peculiar, apparently meaningless power of transforming themselves into a physical facsimile of their victims. One of them is out there now, swirling lazily like a miasmic cloud of saffron dust. Cap handed the book to Rain, who read it, and handed it back without comment. And at that moment Cap saw the kid in his true light, a cold-blooded extrovert who was interested in the ship only for what he could get out of her. Next day, without asking permission, Rain began the task of dismantling the Perseus. He knew he had a potential fortune at his fingertips, for every portable object he could transport back to Earth or Venus would bring a high price from curio-hungry antique hunters. For a week he worked almost unceasingly at the salvage operation. He unscrewed the ship's nameplate and made a little plush box for it. He took down the dials of the cosmoscope, the astrolabe, and other smaller instruments, and made them ready for shipment. He stripped out the entire intercom mechanism, the old-fashioned lighting fixtures, to say nothing of the furniture and personal effects which hadn't spoiled by time. It was a Sunday evening that matters came to a head. In the early dusk, Straba's twin moons were well above the horizon, shining with a pale light. Cap was in the kitchen, brewing himself a cup of coffee, when through the window he saw Rain emerge from the Perseus and carry an armful of equipment across to the little lean-to shed where he stored the salvage. He came out of the shed, and something prompted him to look forward. An instant later he ran to the house and took the steps 3 at a time to the observatory. He was up there a quarter of an hour before he came down again, a queer look on his face. "Mr. Barlow," he said, "what's that thing that looks like a gun emplacement on the flat on the other side of the house?" "That's exactly what it is," Cap told him. "A Dofield atomic defender. I've had that gun here a long time. When I first set up housekeeping on Straba, this part of the system was pretty wild. Pirates weren't unusual." "What's its range?" "Well, I don't know exactly, but it has a double trajectory that makes it a pretty potent weapon." Rain looked at the old man for a long moment. "You probably don't believe in coincidences," he said, "but come upstairs. I want to show you something." Cap followed him up to the observatory and looked through the scope. At first he couldn't believe his eyes. If he had been alone, he would have said he was dreaming. But there it was, a miniature satellite caught helplessly in the planet's polar attraction, midway between Straba's twin moons. He was looking at another antiquated space vessel, a ship that almost detail for detail was a replica of the Perseus. The truth dawned on him gradually. It was the Andromeda, the sister ship of the Perseus. The kid didn't hurry himself, bringing in the Andromeda. For 2 nights he did nothing but watch the sister ship through the scope. Then he carefully removed the preservative covering from the Dofield defender, cleaned and oiled the barrel, and made the gun ready for a charge. "If I can put a shot abaft her midsection," he said, "it might spin her out of polar draw long enough to fall into Straba's linear attraction." "Why don't you take your ship up and tow her in?" Cap said. Rain shook his head. "Too dangerous. I'd have to come to a dead stop to fasten my grappler, and at that range I'd likely become a satellite myself." Meantime the Perseus lay neglected, save for the tour of inspection Cap took through her on Friday morning. Cap hadn't been in the ship since Rain had started his salvage operations, and the old man was curious to see how work had progressed. He entered through the refuse scuttle and proceeded to the control room. The bulkheads were bare expanses with only a few nests of torn wires and broken conduits to show where the dials and gauges had been ripped from their mounting places. The place looked desecrated and defiled. Cap left the control room and mounted to the pilot's cuddy. Here, too, Rain's work was in evidence. The old man stood there looking at the dismantled chart screens and thinking about the ship's strange and tragic past. Her lifeboats were gone, and the inner door of the airlock was still open. Her passengers and crews must have attempted escape in the end. Had they managed to slip by the absorber and reach the asteroid, the name or chart number of which the captain had neglected to mention in the log? And were there such things as absorbers, or had the captain, under stress of the situation, given in to his emotions and flights of fancy? Cap had heard the usual sailor stories, of course, how a freighter had come upon one of them off Saturn's rim and sent out a gig to investigate, how the gig and all men in it had simply dissolved and become a part of the writhing cloud of mist, and how that cloud had then slowly coalesced into the shape of the 6 men and the gig. As he stood there, Cap abruptly became aware of a vague pulsation, a rhythmic thudding from far off. He put his ear to the wall. The sound lost some of its vagueness, but was still undeterminable as to source. He went down the port ladder to the 'tween deck. Here the sound faded into nothingness, only to return as he descended the catwalk to the engine room. But in that cavern-like chamber he became conscious of something else. He had a feeling he was surrounded by life, as if he stood within the body of a living intelligence whose material form included the ship itself. Clearly audible now was that distant thud, 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 like the beating of a great heart. Saturday Rain announced he was ready to shoot down the Andromeda. Unfortunately, Cap figured he wouldn't be there to see the show. He had had a signal from one of his weather robots on the dark side of the planet that morning, reporting that a cold front was moving down, and the migration of the Artox was about to begin. The Artox could be mighty troublesome when they came in mass. If Cap didn't want his golf course eaten to the roots, he'd have to stop them before they started. The generators which powered the barrier wires across the pass would have to be turned on and the relay stations set in order. It was late before he made his return. Dusk had set in, and the Straba's twin moons were riding high when he reached the hill overlooking the house. On the flat below him he could see the moonlight glint on the barrel of the Dofield Defender, and he could see Clarence Rain standing by the gun as he made preparations to fire. For a moment Cap stood there, drinking in the scene. His golf course spread out in the blue light like a big carpet, and then in the center of it the black cigar-shaped Perseus. There was something virile about that antiquated ship, something different from the Andromeda he had seen through scope. It was as if the Perseus were all masculine, while the Andromeda were its dainty feminine counterpart. And then Rain touched the trigger. There was an ellipse of yellow flame, a mushroom of white smoke, and a dull roar. Cap was flung backward by the shock. The hills fielded the explosion, flung it back, and the thunder went grumbling over the countryside. In the empty silence that followed, Cap's wristwatch ticked off the passing minutes. The moonlight returned from behind a passing cloud to reveal Rain by the Dofield Defender, binoculars to his eyes. Time snailed by. The night was passing. And then the roar came again, this time from above. Cap saw a great cylindrical shadow slanting down from the sky. The Andromeda struck far out on the flat beyond the house. It struck with a crash of grinding metal and crumbling girders. For an instant after that a hush fell over everything, and then from the Perseus and the golf course came a sound, low at first, growing louder and louder. To Cap it sounded like a moan of anguish, of hatred and despair that seemed to issue from 100 throats. The Perseus trembled, began to move. Cap stared. The ship moved on its belly across the fairway. Like a timeless juggernaut, it entered the flat and slid out across the tableland toward the crumpled wreckage of its sister vessel. Rain twisted about as he heard the thunder of that advancing hulk. Fear and disbelief contorted his face. He uttered a cry, leapt from the mount of the Dofield, and began to run wildly across the flat. For an instant Cap thought he was going to reach the first low hillock that led to higher ground and safety. But Cap had reckoned without the terrific drive of that vessel. Was it the Absorber, that strange creature of outer space which had transposed its own inexplicable life into the shell of the dismantled Perseus? And now was that ship alive, with all the ship's hates, joys, and sorrows? Organic into inorganic, a transmutation of a supernormal life into a materialistic structure of metal? Cosmic metapsychosis too tremendous for the finite mind to grasp? The Perseus came on, bowling across the flat like a monster of metal gone mad, grinding over rock outcrop and gravel, throwing up a thick cloud of dust. It came on with a terrible fixation of purpose, with a relentless compulsion that knew no halting. It met and engulfed the helpless figure of Clarence Rain, and a cry of mingled hate and triumph seemed to rise up from its metal body. The Perseus continued along the moonlit plateau, heading straight for the wreckage of the Andromeda. Not until it had reached that formless mass did it stop. Then it shuddered to a standstill and ever so gently touched its prow to the prow of the sister ship. For a long moment Cap stood there motionless. Then, head down, he slowly made his way down the hill toward his house. End of Strangers to Straba by Carl Jacobi.